Good morning, Natasha Mitchell joining you now on RN for Life Matters. Thanks for your company, very much indeed. Coming up on the show, why are there so few men working in the early childhood professions or childcare in Australia? 3%, just 3% are men. Is it pay? Is it stigma? Is it status? Very interesting reflections coming in from you on the Life Matters Facebook page on this one. Keep them coming throughout the show. We're coming to that shortly. Also, we're getting dramatic. It's 50 years of the Australian Theatre for Young People. Rosie Fisher joined when she was 10, has been involved ever since. Wendy Blacklock, now in her 80s, was there from the very start, 1963. That's coming up. Kicking off with the transnational story, Australians have a special relationship with New Zealand and the Kiwis who cross the ditch to call this place home. Now, since 2001, about 250,000 New Zealanders have been able to come and live here on a special visa which allows them to work without restriction. That's the upside of the relationship. The downside is that they are not entitled to a wide range of social welfare benefits, including unemployment and sickness benefits, public housing, or, and this is particularly critical for young people, HECS loans for higher education. And Life Matters looked at the situation 18 months ago, and unbelievably, the conversation on our webpage has not stopped since. Every week we get more vexed posts from New Zealanders who have lived here for many, many years. And so we wanted to look into this issue again this morning. Paul Hamer is a research associate of Maori Studies at Victoria University in Wellington, New Zealand. He has extensive knowledge of Maori migration to Australia in particular. Welcome, Paul.
Hi, Natasha.
Why is this visa rule in place? Australians in New Zealand certainly have full access to social security. Why are the restrictions on New Zealanders in Australia? Tell us the context.
In around the year 2000, in the late 1990s, certainly the Howard government had become unhappy with the flow being so predominantly in the direction of Australia rather than Australians moving to New Zealand. So, and they were unhappy about what they saw as the amount of welfare payments they were potentially liable for New Zealanders moving across the Tasman. In 2000, there was a 2-year stand down for the dole introduced, but obviously this didn't go far enough. And one thing that irked the Australians was an amnesty New Zealand had sometime around then for people from the Pacific who'd overstayed in New Zealand and were able to have their residence or citizenship confirmed as a result of that. And Australia believed that it needed to control New Zealand's borders, have a common border policy if this open arrangement was going to continue. And that's what led to the 2001 changes.
So the concern was that New Zealand would sort of become a kind of route for backdoor migration to Australia from the Pacific.
That was clearly a concern. Philip Ruddock talked about that quite a lot. And that was the perception. I think that some large proportion of the New Zealand citizens who are arriving in Australia were born in third countries.
Now, New Zealanders are still able to come here and work on this visa. They have unrestricted working rights, in fact. So there's a clear benefit there that's not available to other nationals from other countries.
Well, it's not totally unrestricted. I mean, as a non-citizen, of course, you can't work for the Australian federal government. But yes, you're right, it's a special relationship, one that's of very long standing. I mean, the formalities around this date back to 1973 when the Trans-Tasman Travel Arrangement was agreed, where citizens from both countries could flow between each other's nations and work. But of course, what we've had since 2001 is a kind of a restriction on the rights of access to the sort of benefits of civic life that hadn't been anticipated when the agreement was drawn up in 1973. I think in 2001 Australia changed and started to treat New Zealanders much more like guest workers, but guest workers who could live indefinitely and raise children in Australia. So that's where some of these inequities are starting to come in.
Well, let's look at how they are starting to reveal themselves, because it is a confusing picture here. They do get some benefits. They can get Medicare, family tax benefit, childcare, but they, for example, don't get any financial support if they want their children to go to TAFE or university, and certainly no unemployment benefits. So young people who have grown up here, done high school here, think of themselves as Australian, for example, can't get HECS. So what are the consequences then for them?
Yeah, well, those are children who weren't born in Australia and maybe came as infants. So when they finish high school, they effectively prevented from further study, and it's, I suppose what it's doing is creating an intergenerational cycle of sort of low-end jobs, and of course some of these are very bright children. They've got tremendous prospects, and it seems in some ways like Australia's shooting itself in the foot, because it would be inherently more productive all round if these kids were facilitated in going into university and then becoming more productive and higher tax-paying members of society. So it's a vicious cycle.
Yes, I mean, they certainly could pay upfront fees. And at this point, I'd like to bring in Dr. Alison Green into the conversation. She is a New Zealander who migrated here with her family in 2002, a year after the visa changes. She's the author of Migrating Close to Home. Welcome to Life Matters, Alison.
Hi.
Now, just tell us your situation. Did you have a clear understanding of the rules when you came to Australia of this particular visa?
We understood the rules in the sense that the whole situation had been well publicised in 2000, and warning was given. It came in 2001. So we understood that although we were skilled migrants, our age would restrict us from a pathway to permanent residency. What we didn't understand was that our children, who were then 10 and 13, would not have a pathway to permanent residency when they became adults. The media at the time was saying that, basically it's business as usual. Australia has made it more difficult to get permanent residency or to get citizenship, but you can still come, you can live here for as long as you like, and if you're between 18 and 44, as it was at the time, then permanent residency is an option.
Right, but that's not the case. So what's been the consequence, Alison, for your daughter in particular?
Well, we have two daughters. They were 10 and 13 when we arrived. They're now 20 and 24. And because we hadn't anticipated the difficulty with student loans, we decided to pay for our daughters' undergraduate education. So we've paid about $40,000 in fees and textbook costs, and we also paid our daughters' living expenses while they study.
Okay, so that's a significant expense. You can probably perhaps afford that. Many possibly couldn't.
We're middle income. The crunch now is that my older daughter did a film and television degree, so she has no pathway to permanent residency because that kind of the editing work that she does isn't on the skilled migration list. My younger daughter has wanted to be a doctor since about year 9, and the issue now, of course, is that we can't afford to fund her the cost of studying to be a doctor, which is about another $40,000.
So the option would be for her to study in New Zealand, would it not?
That is not an option. To study medicine in New Zealand in the graduate entry program, you must have done your undergraduate degree in New Zealand, which makes perfect sense from a New Zealand government bang for their buck point of view. We didn't realise that at the time my daughter graduated from high school.
So the visa arrangement really does change the life choices that your children have at their disposal.
And the irony for my daughters and for the many, many other children who, as Paul has said, have been raised in Australia, may have come over as infants, consider themselves Australian, is that they have no access, or it's very difficult for them to access the very education that would give them the skills that would allow them to become skilled migrants. So it's a real catch-22 situation.
It is a catch-22 situation, especially if they are very much identifying as Australian. Paul Hamer at Victoria University in Wellington, New Zealand. Let me bring you back in here. Prime Minister Gillard has made it clear that the special visa rules will stay in place even after a recent meeting with your Prime Minister. Is that going to put a lid on the flow of New Zealanders, do you think?
No, the flow of New Zealanders is determined much more by the economic fortunes of the two countries, and so as long as Australia continues to do better than New Zealand, then people will migrate. That's as simple as that. I mean, what happened in 2001 was that these changes were made, I think, as a way of filtering out those New Zealanders who would never be eligible if they came from other countries for permanent residence. The idea was that if there was no welfare on offer, then these people just wouldn't come. But of course that hasn't happened. People have come in droves, in part because Australia has boomed in recent years, particularly in, obviously the resource areas like Western Australia. So no, I don't think anything she said will make any difference.
Despite the fact that it's in effect kneecapping the higher education opportunities of their children.
Well, I mean, one thing a lot of people say is that there needs to be better publicity about what people will face when they move over. So I think that's a given. I think that does need to happen. I'm just undertaking PhD studies myself at Monash at the moment, and I'm surveying Māori around Australia as to what they knew when they moved to Australia about the rule changes, and a lot of people were unaware and still remain unaware, for example, that if your child is born in Australia and you're not a permanent resident holder or citizen, then that child won't be an Australian citizen until they turn 10. So people aren't aware of these things, and it would be good if they were made more aware. But I think what we need is some kind of pathway for people so they're not stuck in this perpetual situation.
And what would that pathway look like, do you think?
Well, there were some papers released before under your Freedom of Information Act recently, which said that immigration officials in Australia were suggesting maybe after 8 years of residence, New Zealanders could then get permanent residence. But it wasn't clear whether they'd just be awarded that or whether they'd actually have to go through the very expensive application process, which involves all sorts of checks and probably the use of a migration agent to make sure you're doing it right. So, I mean, I think something fairer could be, maybe a 5-year waiting period, and then being able to obtain residency as of right, rather than to have to go through that expensive formality.
Why should New Zealanders, given the complex migration debate in Australia, why should New Zealanders get special privileges here, given the kind of global need amongst others?
Well, I mean, it is a special arrangement between the two countries, but you could say, why do all the member states of the EU have these arrangements with each other? I mean, Australia and New Zealand have that special close relationship and connection. Australia benefits a lot from the open door because New Zealanders have a very high labour force participation rate. They pay a lot of tax, much in excess of the amount that the Australian government would have to pay to them in welfare. So, it works out quite well for Australia. They get a lot of trained, educated young adults who are motivated to work and get ahead. But, of course, Australia can set its own rules. It's just some of those rules that Australia sets may even be in breach of Australia's international obligations.
Recent decades, no doubt about it, enormously. Men are more hands-on as fathers, and they relish that relationship in ways they weren't really given an opportunity to in the past. Everyone wins, it would seem. Kids, parents, all of us. Why then is it that only 3% of the early childcare workforce is male? Does that picture need to change? Men are a significant minority in this profession. Is it because it's still seen as so-called women's work? Is it a question of woeful pay rates? What about that unspoken and unquestioned stigma that's hard to shake about men working around small children? Very delicate indeed. We want to talk about all that, and joining me this morning is Craig Darcy. He's Centre Coordinator of Little Shearwater, they're a Steiner preschool and kindy, I should say, in lovely Mullumbimby. And when he was studying early childcare back in 95, he was the only man in the course. Welcome, Craig.
Good morning, Natasha.
Good to have you here. And also joining us is Dr. Richard Fletcher. He's leader at the Fathers and Families Research Centre at Newcastle University. Welcome, Richard.
Good morning.
Craig, how's the day started for you at Mullumbimby?
Nicely. I've been into the preschool and, everyone's fine.
What drew you to working in early childcare?
A couple of different factors, I suppose. As a young fella, I could see it as an industry where I could see it growing and being lots of opportunities for work, for one thing, with more women getting into the workforce in particular. But also I could see that perhaps as a male there was a bit of a niche there where children could benefit from having that stable, positive male influence.
You've done some quite nuanced thinking about that, actually. What kind of unique attributes do you think men can bring to the childcare setting and early preschool settings?
I suppose we don't want to do stereotypical things with the children. You know, I don't do woodwork and my colleagues don't do sewing, for example, with the children. So I think it just brings a different, I suppose it's showing the children a gender identity that is like you said in the introduction, it's happening more in the community in general with families, with father involvement increasing. But our early childhood services aren't reflecting those changes and haven't done, for the last, X amount of years. So I think, my colleagues say it provides a different dynamic to interactions with the children, different sorts of play, perhaps, and also a different dynamic within the teams, predominantly female teams that I've worked in the past.
So let's get detailed here. What have you witnessed or directly encountered yourself in terms of the stigmas attached to men working in early childcare?
Okay, I have to say that I've had very positive experiences.
That's good to hear.
Myself. I think, when I began studying, I was 19. I went to a training institution where, we had a doll bathing exam, and I was the only male in the class, and I passed the doll on by its leg to the next student, and I failed that part of the course.
That's great.
Yeah, so I suppose, I've had very positive experiences. I have had one family who on the enrolment form wrote words to the effect, if there was a male at this centre, that have nothing to do with my child, and highlighted that.
You certainly have, though, worked to modify your behaviours to kind of compensate for the fact that you are a male, and some people do have anxieties around men in early childhood education. How?
Well, I think I've learnt along the way I have to have those different things in mind that my female colleagues don't even have to think about. So it's building up trust with the parents is number one, and with the staff as well. But I suppose, you come up with strategies when you're first meeting a family, saying, I'm a dad, I have my own children.
6 children, I think.
6 children altogether, yes. That sort of beginning conversation perhaps can be a good start to build up a good trusting relationship with that family. So it's doing those kind of things, but also, as all early childhood work